"You're just another failure waiting to happen." The judge's voice rang out in the silent courtroom, sharp and unforgiving. The words echoed like thunder, bouncing off the walls, and the room collectively gasped. Heads turned toward the defendant, a tall black teenager standing at the center of the storm. His hands trembled slightly, but his face remained calm. The courtroom was packed, reporters with their notepads ready, spectators leaning forward to catch every word, and the teen's mother seated in the front row, her hands clasped tightly together. The judge's tone carried a biting edge that made everyone squirm in their seats. But it was the teen's response that truly left the room stunned. He paused for a moment, his eyes locking onto the judge's, and then he said something so unexpected that the silence afterward felt suffocating. The judge's face hardened, the lawyers exchanged uneasy glances, and the spectators sat frozen, their curiosity gnawing at them. But what had brought them all here? What had led to this electrifying moment? It all began 6 months earlier, on a muggy summer evening in Chicago. Tyrone Parker was just 17, a high school junior with a passion for coding and a dream of studying computer science. His life was far from easy. Living in a neighborhood where opportunities were rare and trouble seemed to lurk around every corner, Tyrone worked hard to stay focused. His mother, Deborah, a nurse who juggled double shifts, often reminded him of the importance of staying on the right path. "You're smarter than this place, Ty," she'd say, wiping her hands on her scrubs after a long day. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." That night, Tyrone had been walking home from his part-time job at the library when the police cruiser pulled up. He didn't think much of it until 2 officers stepped out and approached him. "Hey kid, what are you doing out here?" one of them asked, his tone more accusatory than curious. Tyrone explained he was on his way home, but the officers didn't seem satisfied. They began asking more questions, their voices growing sharper with each word. Tyrone felt his chest tighten. He'd seen enough news stories to know how quickly situations like this could spiral out of control. One of the officers pointed to a backpack slung over his shoulder. "What's in there?" "Just my laptop and a few books," Tyrone replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Mind if we take a look?" the other officer asked, though it didn't sound like a question. Tyrone hesitated, but eventually handed over the bag. The officers rummaged through it, pulling out his laptop and flipping it open without asking for his permission. "Looks expensive," one of them muttered. "Where'd you get this?" "I saved up for it," Tyrone said, his frustration starting to show. "I work at the library." But his explanation didn't seem to matter. Before he knew it, the officers were accusing him of stealing the laptop, claiming it matched the description of one reported stolen earlier that week. Tyrone protested, insisting it was his, but the officers weren't listening. They placed him in handcuffs and told him he was under arrest. The next few hours were a blur of cold interrogation rooms and accusatory questions. Tyrone's mother arrived at the station, her face pale with worry, but even she couldn't convince the officers to release him. They claimed they had evidence tying Tyrone to the crime, though they refused to show it. When Tyrone was finally released on bail, he was a shell of the confident, ambitious teenager he'd been just hours earlier. The charges against him threatened not only his freedom but also his future. Word spread quickly in the neighborhood, and soon everyone had an opinion. Some believed Tyrone was innocent, while others weren't so sure. As the weeks went on, Tyrone's life became a series of court dates, lawyer meetings, and whispered conversations behind his back. His once bright eyes now carried a weight that didn't belong on the face of a teenager. Deborah did everything she could to support him, but even her unwavering faith couldn't shield him from the harsh reality he was facing. And then came the day of the preliminary hearing. The courtroom was filled with people eager to see how the case would unfold. The prosecutor painted a picture of Tyrone as a troublemaker, while his lawyer tried to prove otherwise. But it was the judge's words that struck the deepest blow. "You've been given every opportunity," the judge said, his tone dripping with disdain. "And yet, here you are wasting it all." The room was so still you could hear the faint hum of the air conditioner. Deborah's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. Tyrone stood motionless, his face a mask of calm, but inside, he was boiling with anger and hurt. And then he spoke. What he said next would shake the very foundation of the courtroom, leaving everyone reeling. But before the full weight of his words could sink in, the sound of the gavel brought the hearing to an abrupt end. The events leading up to this moment were only the beginning. The gavel's crack echoed in the courtroom, jolting everyone out of their stunned silence. Tyrone's words hung in the air like a thick fog, but before anyone could fully process what had just happened, the judge ended the hearing abruptly. "All rise," the bailiff called out, and the room stood in unison as the judge swept out, his robes billowing behind him. Tyrone glanced at his mother, whose expression was a mix of pride and worry. He knew the battle was far from over, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in a long time: control. As they exited the courthouse, reporters swarmed them like vultures, shouting questions and shoving microphones in their faces. Deborah shielded Tyrone with her arm, her voice firm. "No comments." Their lawyer, a sharp and determined woman named Amanda Clark, stepped in. "Let's give them some space, folks. This is a young man fighting for his future, not a media circus." Tyrone was grateful for Amanda. She had taken his case pro bono after hearing about his arrest and believed in his innocence as fiercely as his mother did. But even with her on his side, Tyrone knew the odds were stacked against him. They managed to escape the crowd and slip into Amanda's car. As they drove away, the silence was heavy, broken only by the sound of tires on pavement. "Tyrone," Amanda finally said, glancing at him in the rearview mirror, "what you said in there, it was bold. But the judge might not take kindly to it." "I couldn't just stand there and let him talk to me like that," Tyrone said, his voice quiet but steady. "He doesn't know me. He doesn't know my life." Deborah reached over and squeezed his hand. "You did what you had to do, baby. But we've got to be smart about this. They're going to use everything against you." Amanda nodded. "Your mom's right. We'll prepare for the next hearing. The prosecution claims they have evidence, but so far, they haven't shared anything substantial. If they don't produce something solid soon, we can push for dismissal." Tyrone wanted to believe her, but doubt gnawed at him. He stared out the window, watching the city blur by. His neighborhood was a stark contrast to the polished courthouse they had just left. Broken sidewalks, graffiti-covered walls, and boarded-up windows painted a grim picture. But this was home, and he loved it despite its flaws. When they pulled up to their apartment building, Tyrone hesitated before getting out. He turned to Amanda. "Do you really think I have a chance?" Amanda met his gaze, her eyes filled with determination. "I wouldn't be here if I didn't." Her words gave him a sliver of hope, but as he climbed the stairs to their apartment, he couldn't shake the feeling that the system was stacked against him. He knew he wasn't just fighting to prove his innocence. He was fighting against years of prejudice and assumptions about who he was because of the color of his skin. That night, Tyrone lay awake in bed, replaying the day's events in his mind. He thought about the judge's words, the way they had cut into him like a knife. He thought about his mom, who had always been his biggest supporter. And he thought about the moment he decided he wouldn't stay silent, no matter the consequences. The next morning, life went on as usual, or as close to usual as it could get. Tyrone went to school, though he couldn't escape the stares and whispers of his classmates. Some looked at him with pity, others with suspicion. His teachers seemed unsure of how to treat him, and even his closest friends didn't know what to say. During lunch, his best friend Jason finally broke the awkward silence. "Man, I don't care what anyone says. I know you didn't do it." "Thanks," Tyrone said, grateful for the support. "But it feels like everyone else already made up their minds." Jason leaned in, his voice low. "You just have to stay strong, bro. They're trying to break you, but you're tougher than that." Tyrone nodded, but deep down, he wasn't so sure. The weight of the accusations, the court appearances, and the constant scrutiny felt like too much for one person to bear. But he also knew giving up wasn't an option. As the days turned into weeks, the case gained more attention. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as a debate about racial profiling and the justice system. Some rallied behind Tyrone, calling him a victim of systemic racism. Others sided with the police, insisting he must be guilty if he had been arrested. The next court date loomed, and tension in the Parker household reached a boiling point. Deborah worked longer hours to pay for expenses, leaving her exhausted and on edge. Tyrone tried to help out where he could, but his own stress made it hard to focus. One evening, while they were eating dinner, Deborah finally let her frustration show. "This isn't fair, Ty. You're a good kid. You've worked so hard, and now they're trying to take everything from you." Tyrone looked down at his plate, guilt gnawing at him. "I know, Mom. I'm sorry." "Don't you dare apologize," she said, her voice firm. "This isn't your fault. None of this is your fault." Her words were meant to comfort him, but they only made him feel more helpless. He wanted to protect her, to shield her from the pain this situation was causing, but he didn't know how. The night before the next hearing, Tyrone couldn't sleep. He sat at his desk, staring at his laptop. He opened a blank document and started typing. At first, the words came slowly, but soon they flowed freely, pouring out of him like a flood. He wrote about his dreams, his struggles, and the injustice he was facing. He didn't know who he was writing it for, but it felt good to let it out. The next morning, he printed the letter and tucked it into his pocket. He didn't know if he'd ever share it with anyone, but just having it with him gave him a sense of purpose. As they walked into the courthouse, Tyrone felt a strange mix of fear and determination. He didn't know what the day would bring, but he was ready to face it head-on. What he didn't know was that this hearing would bring an unexpected twist that would change everything. The courtroom buzzed with energy as Tyrone, Deborah, and Amanda entered. Journalists were scribbling notes, spectators whispered among themselves, and the prosecution team sat smugly, their expressions exuding confidence. Tyrone swallowed hard, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He felt like a caged animal being put on display, but he reminded himself of the letter in his pocket. It was a small reminder of who he was, a person, not just a defendant. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. His stern gaze swept over the crowd before landing on Tyrone. There was no mistaking the tension in his expression, a subtle warning that Tyrone's words from the last hearing hadn't been forgotten. Tyrone kept his face neutral, refusing to show any sign of intimidation. The prosecutor stood, adjusting her glasses. "Your Honor, the state is prepared to present evidence that directly ties the defendant to the stolen property in question." Amanda leaned toward Tyrone, whispering, "Stay calm. Let's see what they have." The prosecutor clicked a remote, and an image appeared on the large screen in the courtroom. It was grainy footage from a convenience store security camera. The timestamp showed it was taken the night the laptop had allegedly been stolen. In the video, a figure wearing a hoodie was seen walking out of the store with what appeared to be a laptop bag. "This footage," the prosecutor said, "clearly shows the defendant leaving the store with the stolen property." Amanda stood, her voice steady and confident. "Objection, Your Honor. The footage is unclear, and there's no way to definitively identify my client as the person in the video." The judge raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Sustained. The prosecution will need to provide more substantial evidence." The prosecutor, unfazed, continued. "We also have a witness, the store clerk, who identified the defendant as the individual in the footage." Tyrone felt his heart sink. Amanda squeezed his arm lightly. "Don't worry," she whispered. "We'll handle this." The clerk, a middle-aged man with thinning hair, was called to the stand. He seemed nervous as he swore to tell the truth, his hands fidgeting in his lap. "Can you confirm that the defendant is the person you saw leaving the store with the stolen laptop?" the prosecutor asked. The clerk glanced at Tyrone, then quickly looked away. I think so. I mean, it looks like him." Amanda pounced on the hesitation. "Mr. Daniels, you just said you think it was him. Can you say without any doubt that the defendant is the person you saw?" The man hesitated, his brow furrowing. "Well, no. I guess I can't be 100% sure." "Thank you," Amanda said, turning to the judge. "Your Honor, the witness's testimony is inconclusive and cannot be relied upon as definitive evidence." The judge nodded but didn't seem entirely convinced. "We'll proceed." The rest of the hearing dragged on, with the prosecution presenting weak, circumstantial evidence. Amanda countered each point with precision, poking holes in their arguments and raising doubts about their case. Still, Tyrone couldn't shake the feeling that the odds were stacked against him. As the hearing drew to a close, the judge addressed the courtroom. "We will reconvene in 2 weeks. In the meantime, I expect both sides to prepare their arguments thoroughly. Court is adjourned." The gavel slammed down, and the tension in the room broke like a dam. Tyrone exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Deborah hugged him tightly, her voice shaky with relief. "You did good, baby. We're going to get through this." Amanda pulled them aside. "We've got a lot of work to do before the next hearing. The prosecution doesn't have a strong case, but we can't get complacent. Tyrone, I need you to stay focused. This fight isn't over." As they left the courthouse, the media frenzy was even more intense than before. Cameras flashed, and reporters shouted questions, their voices blending into an overwhelming cacophony. Tyrone kept his head down, following Amanda and his mother through the crowd. That night, back at home, Tyrone sat at his desk, staring at his laptop. He couldn't stop thinking about the footage and the clerk's testimony. Both were flimsy at best, but he knew that sometimes flimsy was enough to sway a jury. He pulled out the letter he had written and read it again. It reminded him of who he was, a kid with dreams, a love for coding, and a determination to make something of himself. He wasn't the person the prosecution was trying to portray. He had to hold on to that truth, no matter what. The next day, Amanda called with surprising news. "Tyrone, I've been reviewing the prosecution's evidence, and I found something odd about the footage. The timestamp doesn't match the store's operating hours." Tyrone's heart raced. "What does that mean?" "It means there's a chance the footage was altered," Amanda explained. "I've already filed a motion to have it reviewed by an independent expert. If we can prove it's been tampered with, it could weaken their case significantly." The news gave Tyrone a glimmer of hope, but it also filled him with dread. If the footage had been altered, it meant someone was trying to frame him intentionally. But who? And why? The next 2 weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. Amanda worked tirelessly to build their defense, while Tyrone tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy. He went to school, helped his mom around the house, and avoided the prying eyes of neighbors and classmates. Finally, the day of the next hearing arrived. The courtroom was even more crowded than before, the air thick with anticipation. Tyrone sat at the defendant's table, his palms sweaty but his resolve firm. The hearing began with the judge addressing the prosecution. "I understand there's been a development regarding the security footage. Care to explain?" The prosecutor's expression faltered for the first time. "Your Honor, the defense has raised concerns about the authenticity of the footage. We've submitted it for independent review, but we maintain that it is valid evidence." Amanda stood, her voice calm but firm. "Your Honor, until the review is complete, I request that the footage be excluded from consideration." The judge nodded thoughtfully. "Motion granted. The footage will be temporarily excluded until its authenticity can be verified." Tyrone felt a wave of relief, but it was short-lived. The prosecutor smirked, her confidence returning. "Your Honor, we have additional evidence that places the defendant at the scene of the crime. A witness has come forward with new testimony." The words sent a ripple through the courtroom. Tyrone's stomach dropped. Who was this new witness, and what would they say? The doors opened, and a familiar face walked in, leaving Tyrone frozen in shock. It was someone he knew well, someone he never expected to betray him. Tyrone's heart felt like it stopped as the witness stepped into the courtroom. It was James Carter, a boy from his school, someone Tyrone had known since middle school. They weren't exactly friends, but they'd shared classes, exchanged casual nods in the hallways, and even worked on a group project together once. James avoided looking at Tyrone as he made his way to the stand, his head slightly bowed. The prosecution wasted no time. "Mr. Carter," the prosecutor began, her tone smooth and confident, "can you tell the court where you were on the night of June 15th, the night in question?" James fidgeted in his seat, his fingers gripping the edge of the witness stand. I was near the convenience store," he said quietly. "And did you see anything unusual that night?" she pressed. James hesitated, his eyes flickering toward Tyrone for the briefest moment before darting away. "I saw Tyrone," he mumbled. The courtroom erupted into whispers. Tyrone sat frozen, his mind racing. Why was James doing this? Amanda stood quickly. "Objection, Your Honor. This testimony is vague and lacks detail." "Sustained," the judge said, motioning for the prosecutor to rephrase. "Let me be more specific," the prosecutor said, turning back to James. "Did you see Tyrone Parker near the convenience store carrying a laptop bag?" James's face flushed, and he glanced down at his hands. "Yes," he said, his voice barely audible. Amanda sprang to her feet. "Your Honor, I request a recess to review this new testimony and cross-examine the witness." The judge considered for a moment before nodding. "Granted. Court will reconvene in 1 hour." The gavel slammed down, and Tyrone felt like the room was spinning. Deborah grabbed his hand, her grip firm. "We'll get through this," she said, though her voice trembled with uncertainty. Amanda led them into a small conference room, her expression tense. "Tyrone, do you know this boy?" "Yeah," Tyrone said, his voice shaking. "He goes to my school. But I don't know why he's saying this. I wasn't even near that store." Amanda nodded. "I believe you, but we need to figure out why he's lying. There's more to this than we're seeing." They spent the next hour preparing questions for James, But Tyrone couldn't focus. His mind kept drifting back to the look on James's face, the guilt in his eyes. Something wasn't adding up. When they returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere was even more charged. James was still on the stand, looking like he wanted to disappear. Amanda approached him, her expression calm but sharp. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice steady, "you testified that you saw my client near the convenience store on the night in question. Can you describe what he was wearing?" James hesitated. A hoodie, I think." "What color was the hoodie?" Amanda pressed. "I don't remember," James admitted, squirming in his seat. Amanda nodded, her tone growing firmer. "You don't remember what he was wearing, but you're certain it was him? How can you be so sure?" James's face turned red. I know it was him, okay?" Amanda took a step closer, her gaze piercing. "Mr. Carter, are you aware that making a false statement in court is perjury, a serious crime?" James shifted uncomfortably. "I'm not lying," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Amanda paused, letting the silence hang in the air before delivering her next question. "Mr. Carter, did someone pressure you to give this testimony?" The room went silent, all eyes on James. His hands trembled, and he looked down, refusing to answer. The judge leaned forward. "Answer the question, Mr. Carter." James's voice was barely a whisper. "Yes." The courtroom erupted into chaos. The judge banged his gavel, calling for order. Amanda seized the moment. "Who pressured you?" she asked. James looked terrified, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. Finally, he blurted out, "The prosecutor." The room froze. Even the judge seemed taken aback. The prosecutor jumped to her feet, her face pale. "Your Honor, that's a baseless accusation." Amanda remained calm. "Your Honor, I request an immediate investigation into this matter. If the prosecution coerced a witness, it undermines the integrity of this entire case." The judge rubbed his temples, clearly frustrated. "This is a serious allegation. I will appoint an independent investigator to look into it. Court is adjourned until further notice." The gavel came down, and the courtroom descended into chaos once again. Reporters scrambled for quotes, while spectators whispered furiously among themselves. Tyrone sat in stunned silence, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. As they left the courthouse, Amanda turned to Tyrone and Deborah. "This could be a turning point," she said, her voice cautious but hopeful. "If we can prove misconduct, it could discredit the entire case." Tyrone nodded, but his relief was short-lived. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that the people targeting him wouldn't stop so easily. As they drove home, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from an unknown number. It read, "You think this is over? Think again." Tyrone's blood ran cold. He showed the message to his mom and Amanda, who exchanged worried looks. Amanda's jaw tightened. "We need to report this to the authorities. Whoever is behind this is getting desperate." Tyrone nodded, but inside, he felt a growing sense of dread. The fight for his freedom was far from over, and now, it seemed, the stakes were higher than ever. The message loomed in Tyrone's mind long after he handed his phone to Amanda. The words were simple, but the menace behind them was impossible to ignore. "I'll get in touch with the authorities first thing in the morning," Amanda said firmly. "For now, stay vigilant. If anything else happens, let me know immediately." Deborah placed a protective arm around Tyrone as they headed into their apartment. "We're going to get through this," she said softly, though her eyes betrayed the worry she was trying to hide. That night, Tyrone lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His thoughts were a tangled mess of fear and determination. Someone was going to great lengths to see him fall, but why? He had never been involved in anything illegal, never crossed the wrong people. The idea that someone might target him just because of his race or background made his stomach turn. The next morning, Amanda called as promised. "I've reported the threat, and the police are opening an investigation. It might take time, but at least it's on record." Tyrone tried to focus on her words, but his mind kept drifting to James. Why had he agreed to lie in court? Tyrone decided he needed answers. He texted Jason, his best friend, and asked for James's number. Jason responded almost immediately. "What's going on? You good?" Tyrone hesitated before replying. "Just need to talk to him about the case." "Don't worry, I've got this." A minute later, Jason sent the number. Tyrone stared at his phone, his thumb hovering over the call button. Finally, he pressed it. The line rang twice before James picked up. "Hello. It's Tyrone," he said, keeping his tone even. "We need to talk." James was silent for a moment. I don't think that's a good idea." "I'm not calling to argue," Tyrone said quickly. "I just want to know why. Why did you say those things in court?" James sighed heavily. "I didn't have a choice." "There's always a choice," Tyrone shot back, frustration creeping into his voice. "You could have told the truth." "You don't understand," James said, his voice trembling. "They threatened me. They said if I didn't testify against you, they'd make things bad for my family." "Who's they?" Tyrone demanded. James hesitated. I don't know exactly. Someone from the prosecutor's office called me, but I think there's more to it." It felt bigger than just the case. Tyrone's grip on the phone tightened. "You need to come clean, James. Tell Amanda what you just told me. If you do, she can help you." James let out another shaky sigh. "I'll think about it." "Don't just think about it," Tyrone said, his voice firm. "Do it." The call ended, but Tyrone felt no relief. James's vague answers only deepened the mystery. Who would go to such lengths to frame him, and why? Later that day, Amanda called with more news. "The independent review of the footage came back," she said. "It was doctored, just like we suspected. This is good for us, Tyrone. It casts serious doubt on the prosecution's entire case." Tyrone felt a flicker of hope, but Amanda's next words tempered it. "But it also means someone is actively working to manipulate evidence against you. We need to be careful." Amanda's warnings felt prophetic when 2 days later, their apartment building was vandalized. The words "thief" and "liar" were spray-painted across their front door. Deborah discovered it when she returned from a late shift at the hospital, her face pale as she called Tyrone to come see. Tyrone stood in the doorway, staring at the hateful words. His mother was trembling, her hands gripping the edge of her coat. "This is too much," she whispered. "What do they want from us?" Tyrone clenched his fists, anger surging through him. "They want me to break," he said quietly. "But I won't." Amanda arrived shortly after, her face a mask of controlled fury. She took photos of the vandalism and called the police to report the incident. "This is intimidation, plain and simple," she said. "But it only proves we're making progress. Whoever's behind this is getting scared." The police arrived, but their response was perfunctory at best. They took a report and promised to investigate, but Tyrone doubted anything would come of it. As the officers left, Amanda turned to Tyrone and Deborah. "I'm not going to let them scare us into silence. We're going to keep fighting." That night, as they cleaned the paint from the door, Tyrone felt a strange sense of resolve. Whoever was behind this wanted him to feel powerless, but he wouldn't give them that satisfaction. He was going to see this fight through, no matter what. The next hearing was set for the following week, and Amanda worked tirelessly to prepare. James's confession about being pressured to lie added a new layer to their defense, but Tyrone knew they couldn't rely on him to come forward. The prosecution was too ruthless, their reach too long. The day of the hearing arrived, and the tension in the courtroom was palpable. The judge addressed the room, his tone sharper than usual. "Before we begin, I want to make it clear that any further misconduct from either side will not be tolerated. Is that understood?" Both lawyers nodded, and the hearing began. Amanda presented the findings from the independent review, detailing how the footage had been manipulated. The judge listened carefully, his expression unreadable. Then the prosecutor called their next witness, and the atmosphere in the room shifted. A man in a suit stepped forward, his face unfamiliar to Tyrone. He was introduced as a private investigator hired by the prosecution. The man claimed to have uncovered new evidence, phone records that supposedly linked Tyrone to the stolen laptop. Amanda immediately objected, questioning the validity of the records and demanding they be reviewed. The judge allowed the testimony but promised to consider Amanda's concerns. As the investigator spoke, Amanda's face grew darker, her pen scribbling furiously on her notepad. When the hearing adjourned for the day, Amanda pulled Tyrone aside. "This is serious," she said. "If those phone records hold up, they could damage our case." Tyrone stared at her, his stomach twisting in knots. "But they're lying," he said. "I never made those calls." Amanda nodded. "I believe you. But we need to prove it." As they left the courthouse, Tyrone couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to frame him, they were trying to destroy him completely. And the question that haunted him most was why. The ride home from the courthouse was heavy with silence. Tyrone stared out the window, his mind swirling with thoughts. The new evidence felt like a trap, a calculated move to make him look guilty. At home, Deborah tried to lift his spirits. "We've come this far, Ty. Amanda's not going to let them win." Tyrone nodded, but his confidence wavered. He retreated to his room, pulling out his laptop. He felt a desperate need to understand. If someone was framing him, there had to be a way to uncover the truth. He opened the document where he'd written his thoughts weeks ago, adding a new entry. "They're trying to break me. I don't know who they are, but they've made one thing clear: they're not afraid to play dirty. I have to stay strong, not just for me, but for Mom and everyone else who believes in me." Tyrone closed his laptop, his resolve hardening. Whoever was behind this, he would find out. He decided to start with James. The next morning, Tyrone met James at a small diner on the edge of town. James looked nervous, glancing around as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. "I don't have much time," James said, his voice low. "If they find out I'm talking to you." "I need to know everything," Tyrone interrupted. "Who contacted you? What did they say?" James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It was a man. He called me and said he was working with the prosecution. He told me if I didn't testify, my family would be investigated. He made it sound like they'd find something even if there was nothing to find." "Do you think he was actually with the prosecution?" Tyrone asked. James hesitated. "I don't know. He never gave his name, and he didn't sound official. But I was scared. I didn't want my mom to lose her job or worse." Tyrone's mind raced. This wasn't just about the case. Someone was orchestrating a smear campaign, using fear and manipulation to build a false narrative. "Do you have any proof?" Tyrone asked. James shook his head. "I deleted the call logs. I didn't want anyone to trace it back to me." Tyrone clenched his jaw, frustration bubbling up. "You need to tell Amanda everything." James hesitated, then nodded. "I'll think about it." Tyrone left the diner feeling both frustrated and determined. James's information wasn't concrete, but it was a lead. He called Amanda and relayed everything James had told him. "This confirms our suspicions," Amanda said. "But without evidence, it's his word against theirs. I'll start digging into the prosecution's team. If someone's acting outside the law, we'll find them." The next few days were a blur of waiting and preparation. Amanda focused on discrediting the phone records, enlisting a tech expert to analyze the data. Meanwhile, Tyrone couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Cars he didn't recognize idled near his building, and strangers seemed to linger too long in his peripheral vision. One evening, as Tyrone was walking home from the library, he noticed a man following him. The man wore a baseball cap pulled low over his face, but his posture was unmistakably tense. Tyrone's heart pounded as he quickened his pace, turning down side streets to lose him. When he reached his building, he glanced over his shoulder. The man was gone, but the fear lingered. Tyrone told his mom and Amanda about the incident. Amanda's response was swift. "I'm contacting the police again," she said. "This is escalating, and we can't take any chances." The following day, Amanda called with an update. The tech expert found inconsistencies in the phone records. "It looks like they were altered, just like the footage. This gives us more leverage to challenge the prosecution's case." Tyrone felt a spark of hope, but it was quickly extinguished when Amanda added, "But there's something else. The expert found traces of a third-party access. Someone outside the case is meddling with the evidence." Tyrone's chest tightened. "What does that mean?" "It means there's a larger conspiracy at play," Amanda said. "Someone with resources is trying to sabotage you." The revelation left Tyrone reeling. It wasn't just the prosecution, it was someone bigger, someone pulling strings from the shadows. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was in over his head. The next court hearing arrived faster than expected. The courtroom was packed, the air buzzing with tension. Amanda presented the findings about the phone records, calling the tech expert to the stand to testify. The expert explained in detail how the records had been manipulated, pointing out timestamps that didn't align and metadata showing unauthorized edits. The judge listened intently, his expression grave. The prosecutor attempted to counter, but their arguments were weak. It was clear they hadn't expected Amanda to uncover the truth so quickly. As the hearing neared its conclusion, Amanda addressed the court. "Your Honor, this case has been riddled with misconduct and falsified evidence. My client has been the victim of a targeted campaign to destroy his reputation. We demand a full investigation into these actions." The judge nodded. "I'll take your request under advisement. In the meantime, we'll reconvene in 2 weeks to determine how to proceed." The gavel slammed down, and the courtroom erupted in chatter. Tyrone felt a surge of relief, but it was tempered by the knowledge that the fight wasn't over. As they left the courthouse, Amanda pulled Tyrone aside. "We're making progress, but this isn't over. Whoever's behind this won't stop easily. Stay vigilant." Tyrone nodded, determination burning in his chest. Whoever was trying to frame him had made a mistake. They underestimated his resolve. He was more determined than ever to uncover the truth and prove his innocence. But as the shadows around him deepened, he knew the road ahead would only get more dangerous. The ride home from the courthouse felt surreal. Tyrone stared out the window, his mind caught between relief and dread. Amanda had dismantled the prosecution's claims piece by piece, but he knew the forces working against him were still out there, watching, waiting, plotting their next move. When they arrived home, Deborah hugged Tyrone tightly. "You're strong, Ty. We'll get through this." He nodded, but exhaustion weighed heavily on him. As the door closed behind them, Tyrone's phone buzzed in his pocket. He hesitated before pulling it out, half expecting another threatening message. Instead, it was a text from James. "We need to talk. I have more to tell you." Tyrone stared at the message, his pulse quickening. He immediately forwarded it to Amanda, who replied within minutes, "Meet him, but not alone. I'll send someone to keep an eye out." Later that evening, Tyrone met James at a quiet park on the edge of their neighborhood. Amanda had arranged for a trusted investigator to linger discreetly nearby, providing a sense of security. James looked jumpy, his eyes darting around as if he expected someone to appear out of the shadows. "What's going on?" Tyrone asked, keeping his voice calm. James glanced at the bushes behind them before speaking. "I got another call. This time, they said if I don't stay quiet, they'll come after my little brother." Tyrone's stomach churned. "Did you recognize the voice?" James shook his head. "No. It sounded different from the first guy, but just as serious." Tyrone clenched his fists. "James, you have to tell Amanda everything. She can help protect your family." James hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "I'll do it. But you have to promise me something, Tyrone." "What?" Tyrone asked. "If they find out I talked, you'll make sure my brother's safe," James said, his voice trembling. Tyrone nodded. "You have my word." The next morning, James met with Amanda and provided a detailed account of the threats he'd received. Amanda documented everything, her expression growing more determined with each revelation. "This is exactly what we needed," she said after James left. "It's still circumstantial, but it strengthens our argument that there's a larger conspiracy at play." Tyrone felt a flicker of hope, but it was short-lived. That evening, as he and Deborah were sitting down to dinner, the power went out. At first, they thought it was a neighborhood-wide outage, but a glance out the window showed lights glowing in the surrounding buildings. Deborah called their landlord, but before she could finish explaining the situation, a brick crashed through the living room window, shattering glass across the floor. Deborah screamed, and Tyrone rushed to her side. On the brick, a piece of paper was taped with a simple message scrawled in bold black letters: "Back off." Deborah trembled as Tyrone picked up the note. His hands shook with anger as he read it aloud. "They're trying to scare us," he said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. "But we're not backing down." Amanda arrived minutes later with the police in tow. The officers took their statements and promised to increase patrols in the area, but Tyrone couldn't shake the feeling that their response was more performative than sincere. Amanda inspected the note, her jaw tightening. "They're getting desperate," she said. "Desperate people make mistakes. We'll use that to our advantage." The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence. Tyrone lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts racing. He couldn't let this continue. Whoever was behind this had crossed a line, and he was determined to make them pay. The next morning, Amanda called with surprising news. The police traced the threats to a burner phone purchased 2 months ago. "It's not much, but it's a start. We're also pushing for the judge to issue subpoenas for the prosecution's communications." If someone on their team is involved, we'll find out. Tyrone felt a surge of determination. For the first time, it felt like they were gaining ground. But he also knew that whoever was behind this wouldn't go down without a fight. The next court hearing arrived with a mix of anticipation and dread. The courtroom was packed, the atmosphere electric. Amanda presented the evidence of tampered phone records and doctored footage, methodically dismantling the prosecution's case. The judge listened intently, his expression unreadable. Then Amanda dropped a bombshell. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, "we have reason to believe that a member of the prosecution's team is actively involved in coercing witnesses and fabricating evidence. We request a full investigation into their conduct." The courtroom erupted in whispers. The prosecutor stood, her face pale. "Your Honor, these accusations are baseless." Amanda held her ground. "The evidence speaks for itself. Witnesses have come forward, and we have documentation of tampered evidence. If the prosecution has nothing to hide, they should welcome an investigation." The judge raised a hand, silencing the room. "I'll review the request and make a decision in the next session. For now, we'll adjourn." As the gavel slammed down, Tyrone felt a rush of relief and anticipation. The tide was turning, but the fight wasn't over yet. As they left the courthouse, Amanda leaned in and whispered, "We're close, Tyrone. Closer than ever. But stay alert. They won't go quietly." Tyrone nodded, his resolve stronger than ever. He was ready for whatever came next. The days following the hearing were a blur of anticipation and tension. Amanda worked tirelessly to gather more evidence, while Tyrone focused on staying vigilant. Deborah kept a close eye on him, her worry etched into every glance. One evening, as Tyrone sat at his desk, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Amanda. The judge approved the investigation. Things are about to get interesting. For the first time in weeks, Tyrone felt a glimmer of hope. The investigation meant that the people orchestrating his downfall might finally be exposed. But with hope came fear of what those people might do next. Amanda called the next morning with another update. "The investigation is moving fast. The subpoenas for the prosecution's communications have been issued, and we're expecting results soon. In the meantime, I want you and your mom to stay on high alert. If anything suspicious happens, call me immediately." Tyrone nodded, though Amanda couldn't see him. "Got it." That evening, as he and Deborah were returning from the grocery store, they noticed a car parked across the street from their building. Its windows were tinted, and the engine idled quietly. Tyrone felt a chill run down his spine. "Mom, go inside," he said, his voice low. Deborah hesitated. "Tyrone." "Please," he insisted. Deborah reluctantly obeyed, hurrying inside with the bags. Tyrone stayed on the sidewalk, watching the car. After a moment, the driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses. He stood there for a moment, staring at Tyrone, before getting back into the car and driving away. Tyrone's heart pounded as he hurried inside. He called Amanda and told her what had happened. "This is escalating," Amanda said, her voice tense. "I'll contact the police again and make sure they're taking this seriously. In the meantime, don't confront anyone. Stay safe." Tyrone spent the night replaying the encounter in his mind. The man's presence wasn't random, he was sure of it. Someone was watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. 2 days later, Amanda called with a breakthrough. "Tyrone, we've uncovered something big. The prosecution's lead investigator has been implicated in multiple instances of evidence tampering. The burner phone used to make the threats was purchased with his credit card." Tyrone's eyes widened. "So it's him? He's the one framing me." "It's more complicated than that," Amanda said. "He's part of it, but I think he's answering to someone higher up. This goes beyond your case, it's systemic." Tyrone felt a surge of anger and determination. "What happens now?" "We're pushing for a mistrial," Amanda said. "If the judge agrees, the charges against you will be dropped, and the investigation will expand to uncover everyone involved." The news should have filled Tyrone with relief, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the fight wasn't over. Whoever was behind this wouldn't let things unravel without a fight. The next court hearing arrived, and the tension in the room was palpable. The prosecution was on the defensive, scrambling to justify their actions as Amanda laid out the evidence against them. The judge listened intently, his expression grave. "The defense has presented compelling evidence of misconduct," the judge said finally. In light of this, I am granting the motion for a mistrial. The charges against Tyrone Parker are hereby dismissed. The words hit Tyrone like a wave, washing away weeks of fear and uncertainty. Deborah burst into tears, hugging him tightly as the courtroom erupted in chaos. Reporters shouted questions, and the prosecutor stood frozen, her face pale. But as they left the courthouse, Tyrone couldn't help but feel that the battle wasn't truly over. The people who had tried to destroy him were still out there, and they wouldn't go quietly. That night, as he sat at his desk, his phone buzzed with a new message. It was from an unknown number. This isn't the end. Tyrone stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. They were still out there, still watching. But now he wasn't just a victim, he was ready to fight back. Tyrone couldn't sleep that night. The message from the unknown number echoed in his mind like a relentless drumbeat. This isn't the end. He stared at his phone, his thoughts racing. Who was behind all of this? And how far were they willing to go? The next morning, Amanda called with a sense of urgency. Tyrone, I just got off the phone with the police. They've identified several individuals connected to the lead investigator. It's part of a larger operation targeting people in your community, fabricating cases, coercing witnesses, and profiting from plea deals. Tyrone's stomach churned. Why me though? Why target me specifically? I think you were an easy target, Amanda said. A young black man with a promising future, living in a neighborhood they wanted to exploit. They didn't count on you fighting back. The words gave Tyrone a mix of pride and anger. He wasn't just another statistic, he was someone they couldn't silence. But the fight wasn't over. Later that day, Tyrone met with Amanda at her office. The police had sent over files connecting the operation to higher-ups in the local justice system. As Amanda sifted through the documents, her face grew more serious. This is bigger than I thought, she muttered. There are judges, lawyers, and even businesspeople involved. They've been using their positions to funnel money through bogus charges and plea bargains. Tyrone leaned forward. So what do we do now? We keep building the case, Amanda said. The police are preparing to make arrests, but it'll take time. In the meantime, you need to be careful. They know you're not backing down, and that makes you a threat. That evening, as Tyrone walked home, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows seemed deeper, the air heavier. When he turned a corner, he saw a car idling at the end of the block. Its headlights flicked on as he approached, and it slowly rolled forward. Tyrone's pulse quickened. He turned and started walking faster, his heart pounding in his chest. The car followed, its engine humming ominously. He turned another corner and ducked into a convenience store, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The clerk glanced at him with mild concern. You okay, kid? Tyrone nodded, trying to steady his breathing. He peered out the window and saw the car idling across the street. Whoever was inside wasn't giving up. He pulled out his phone and called Amanda. I think someone's following me. Where are you? She asked, her voice sharp. Near Lawson's grocery on 12th, Tyrone said. There's a car outside, and it's been following me. Stay put, Amanda said. I'm calling the police. Minutes later, a police cruiser pulled up outside the store, its lights flashing. The suspicious car sped off, disappearing into the night. The officers took Tyrone's statement and promised to increase patrols in the area, but Tyrone knew it wasn't enough. Whoever was behind this wouldn't stop until they were exposed. The next day, Amanda received another breakthrough. One of the people implicated in the operation had agreed to testify in exchange for immunity. The testimony pointed to a well-connected businessman named Richard Coleman, who had been funding the operation in exchange for lucrative contracts tied to the justice system. This is it, Amanda said, her eyes blazing with determination. We've got the smoking gun. But Coleman won't go down easily. He's powerful and has deep connections. Tyrone's mind raced. He wasn't just fighting to clear his name anymore, he was fighting to bring down an entire system of corruption. It felt overwhelming, but he knew he couldn't back down. As the weeks passed, the investigation expanded. Coleman's connections to the operation were undeniable, and the evidence mounted against him. But as the case gained traction, Tyrone and his family faced increasing threats. One night, as they were eating dinner, a loud bang shattered the air. They rushed to the window and saw their car engulfed in flames. Tyrone's heart sank as Deborah grabbed his arm, her face pale with fear. Amanda arrived within minutes, along with the police. This is an act of desperation, she said, her voice steady despite the tension. They know they're cornered. The fire only strengthened Tyrone's resolve. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for his family, his community, and everyone who had been wrongfully targeted by the corrupt system. The next court hearing was set to be a pivotal moment. Amanda planned to present the evidence against Coleman and his accomplices, exposing the entire operation to the public. Tyrone knew the risks were higher than ever, but he also knew he couldn't let fear win. The morning of the hearing, Tyrone stood outside the courthouse, taking a deep breath. Reporters swarmed the steps, their cameras flashing as he walked inside with Amanda and Deborah. As they entered the courtroom, Tyrone felt the weight of the moment settle over him. The room was packed, the air electric with anticipation. Coleman sat at the defense table, his expression smug and unbothered. But Tyrone knew that look wouldn't last. Amanda approached the bench, her voice steady as she began to lay out the evidence. "Your Honor, the corruption we're about to expose goes beyond this case. It's a systematic abuse of power designed to exploit the most vulnerable members of our community." As Amanda spoke, Tyrone felt a surge of pride. The truth was finally coming to light, and the people who had tried to destroy him were about to face justice. But as the testimony continued, Tyrone noticed Coleman's expression shift. His smug confidence gave way to a cold glare that sent a shiver down Tyrone's spine. The fight wasn't over yet, and Tyrone knew the final battle was just beginning. The courtroom was tense as Amanda meticulously dismantled the operation, piece by piece. Evidence after evidence was presented: financial records, forged documents, and even intercepted communications that tied Richard Coleman directly to the scheme. The weight of her presentation was undeniable, and for the first time, Coleman's composure cracked. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his jaw clenched tightly. When Amanda introduced the testimony of the whistleblower, a hush fell over the room. The witness, a former associate of Coleman, described in chilling detail how the operation had been orchestrated to target young black men and women in underprivileged communities. "They knew these people didn't have the resources to fight back," the whistleblower said, his voice steady despite the enormity of his confession. "It wasn't just about money, it was about control. They wanted to keep the system rigged in their favor." The judge leaned forward, his expression dark. "This testimony is damning, to say the least. I trust the prosecution will address these allegations." The prosecutor looked pale, fumbling through her notes as she tried to mount a defense. "Your Honor, while these claims are serious, they do not absolve the defendant of the charges brought against him." Amanda stood again, her voice sharp. "Your Honor, the charges against Tyrone Parker were fabricated as part of this operation. Every piece of evidence against him has been proven to be falsified or coerced. The real criminals are sitting in this courtroom, hiding behind wealth and influence." The judge nodded solemnly. "This court will review the evidence thoroughly. For now, we will take a brief recess." The gavel struck, and the tension in the room broke. Tyrone leaned back in his chair, his heart pounding. Deborah grabbed his hand, her grip firm but comforting. "You're doing great, baby," she whispered. "Just hang in there." During the recess, Amanda pulled Tyrone aside. "We're making progress, but don't let your guard down. Coleman's team will fight back with everything they have. We need to stay focused." Tyrone nodded, determination burning in his chest. "I'm ready." When court resumed, Coleman's lawyer took the floor, trying to discredit the whistleblower's testimony. "Your Honor, this witness has every reason to lie. He's seeking immunity for his own crimes and cannot be trusted." Amanda countered swiftly. "The evidence corroborates his testimony. The financial records, the burner phones, the doctored footage, it all points back to Coleman and his associates." The back and forth was fierce, but the cracks in Coleman's defense became increasingly evident. As the day drew to a close, the judge called for an adjournment, promising a decision on the case within a week. As Tyrone and his family left the courthouse, the crowd of reporters outside was larger than ever. Cameras flashed, and microphones were thrust toward him, but Amanda shielded him from the chaos. "No comments for now," she said firmly, guiding them to a waiting car. That night, Tyrone couldn't sleep. He sat at his desk, staring at the photos of his family pinned to the wall. They were his reason to keep fighting, his reason to never give up. He picked up his pen and wrote in his journal. "They tried to silence me, to break me, but I'm still here. This isn't just my fight anymore, it's for everyone they've hurt, everyone they've wronged. I won't stop until justice is served." The following week, the judge delivered his decision. Coleman and several others were charged with multiple counts of corruption, evidence tampering, and conspiracy. The case against Tyrone was formally dismissed, and his record was cleared. The courtroom erupted in applause as the judge's words echoed through the chamber. Deborah wept openly, pulling Tyrone into a tight embrace. Amanda smiled, her eyes shimmering with emotion. "You did it," she said softly. "You never gave up." But the victory wasn't without its challenges. Coleman was out on bail, and his wealth and influence meant the fight wasn't truly over. As Tyrone walked out of the courthouse, he noticed a familiar car idling nearby. The man from the other night sat inside, his gaze locked on Tyrone. Amanda noticed too. "We'll report this," she said. "But for now, let's focus on the win. You're free, Tyrone. You can start rebuilding your life." The weight of her words hit Tyrone like a wave. He was free, but the shadows still lingered. As he stood on the courthouse steps, surrounded by his family and supporters, he made a silent promise to himself. This was just the beginning. The fight for justice wasn't over, and he was ready for whatever came next. The weeks following the courtroom victory were a whirlwind for Tyrone. His name was cleared, but his life was far from returning to normal. The media painted him as both a hero and a victim, and while some celebrated his resilience, others still questioned the legitimacy of his innocence. He had won the battle, but it felt like the war was far from over. Amanda's warning about Coleman's influence loomed over Tyrone's thoughts. Coleman had been charged, but his release on bail made it clear he wasn't out of moves. Tyrone couldn't shake the memory of the man in the car, his cold stare burning in his mind. Every shadow felt threatening, every unfamiliar face a potential enemy. One evening, Tyrone was at home with his mother when his phone buzzed. It was Jason, his best friend. "Hey man," Jason said, his voice tense. "You need to see this." Tyrone opened the link Jason sent. It was a local news article reporting that Coleman had filed a countersuit against Amanda and Tyrone, claiming defamation and damages to his reputation. Tyrone's blood boiled as he read the details. Coleman was doubling down, trying to paint himself as the victim. "This guy's unbelievable," Tyrone muttered. Deborah looked over his shoulder, her face pale. "What does this mean for us, Ty?" "It means he's scared," Tyrone said, his voice steady. "Amanda will know how to handle this." The next morning, Tyrone and Deborah met with Amanda at her office. She was already aware of the countersuit and had begun preparing a response. "This is a classic intimidation tactic," Amanda said. "Coleman is trying to muddy the waters and divert attention from his own crimes. We won't let him win." Tyrone nodded, but a part of him felt overwhelmed. "What do we do now?" "We fight back," Amanda said firmly. "The countersuit has no merit, and we'll prove that in court. In the meantime, I've reached out to some journalists who want to tell your side of the story. If you're up for it, this could be an opportunity to set the record straight." Tyrone hesitated. The idea of speaking publicly about his ordeal was daunting, but he knew how important it was to expose the truth. "I'll do it," he said finally. "People need to know what really happened." The following week, Tyrone sat down for his first interview. The journalist, a young black woman named Rachel, made him feel at ease with her empathetic approach. "Tyrone," she began, "you've been through so much in such a short time. How has this experience changed you?" Tyrone thought for a moment before answering. "It's taught me how broken the system is, but it's also shown me how strong I can be. They tried to take everything from me, but I didn't let them." Rachel nodded. "What would you say to others who might be facing similar injustices?" "Don't give up," Tyrone said, his voice firm. "Find people who believe in you, who will fight for you. And don't be afraid to speak up, even when it feels like no one's listening." The interview aired later that week, and the response was overwhelming. Messages of support poured in from across the country. Activists reached out, offering their platforms to amplify Tyrone's story. The tide was turning, and Coleman's countersuit began to lose traction in the court of public opinion. But Coleman wasn't done. One night, as Tyrone was leaving a community center where he'd been speaking to local youth, he noticed the same car from before parked across the street. His heart pounded as the engine roared to life, and the car sped toward him. Tyrone jumped out of the way just in time, landing hard on the sidewalk. The car screeched away, disappearing into the night. Bystanders rushed to help him, and someone called the police. When Amanda heard what happened, she was livid. "This isn't just intimidation anymore. This is attempted murder. We'll make sure the police take this seriously." The incident only strengthened Tyrone's resolve. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore, he was fighting for everyone who had been silenced, everyone who had been wrongfully accused. He spoke out more boldly, sharing his story at rallies and community events, inspiring others to stand up against injustice. As the countersuit dragged on, Coleman's allies began to abandon him. The mounting evidence against him and the growing public support for Tyrone made him a liability. By the time the countersuit went to trial, Coleman's defense was in shambles. Amanda's cross-examination of Coleman was brutal. She exposed his lies, his connections to the corruption, and his blatant attempts to manipulate the system. By the end of the trial, Coleman's smug facade had crumbled completely. When the judge dismissed the countersuit and upheld the charges against Coleman, the courtroom erupted in applause. Tyrone felt a weight lift off his shoulders as Deborah hugged him tightly. "You did it, Ty," she whispered. "You won." But Tyrone knew the victory wasn't just his. It belonged to everyone who had stood with him, everyone who had believed in him when the odds were stacked against him. As he left the courthouse that day, he felt a new sense of purpose. His fight was far from over, but for the first time, he felt ready to face whatever came next. The dismissal of Coleman's countersuit marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Tyrone's name was finally cleared, and the web of corruption that had ensnared him was unraveling. Arrests continued as more individuals were implicated, and the community rallied behind Tyrone as a symbol of resilience and hope. But the scars of the ordeal were not easily forgotten. Tyrone spent weeks reflecting on everything that had happened, how close he had come to losing everything and how, against all odds, he had fought back. He realized that his story wasn't just about his survival, it was about changing the system that had nearly destroyed him. Amanda, ever the strategist, approached Tyrone with an idea. "There's a lot of momentum behind your story right now. If you're willing, we could use it to push for real change. Policy reforms, community outreach programs, maybe even legal aid for others who've been targeted." Tyrone didn't hesitate. "Let's do it. I don't want anyone else to go through what I did." With Amanda's help, Tyrone began working with local organizations to address systemic injustice. He spoke at schools, rallies, and town halls, sharing his story and advocating for change. His humility and passion resonated with people from all walks of life, and soon he became a recognizable face in the fight for justice. At home, life began to stabilize. Deborah, who had been his rock through it all, returned to her job at the hospital with renewed pride in her son. Their once tense apartment was now filled with laughter and hope. Neighbors who had once whispered about Tyrone's guilt now greeted him with smiles and encouragement. One day, as Tyrone was preparing for a speech at a community event, Jason stopped by. "Man, look at you," Jason said with a grin. "You're like a celebrity now." Tyrone chuckled. "I'm just trying to do what's right." Jason nodded, his expression serious. "You're doing more than that. You're making a difference." The event that day was packed, with people spilling out of the doors and onto the streets. Tyrone took the stage, his heart pounding as he looked out at the crowd. He saw faces of all ages, colors, and backgrounds, people who believed in him, who believed in change. He took a deep breath and began. "A few months ago, I was sitting in a courtroom, scared and angry, wondering if my life was over before it had even really begun. They tried to silence me, to break me, to make me believe I didn't matter. But I'm here today to tell you they failed." The crowd erupted into applause, and Tyrone continued, his voice strong and clear. "They failed because I had people who believed in me, my mom, my lawyer, my community. They failed because I refused to give up, and because together, we stood up against injustice." He paused, scanning the sea of faces. "But this fight isn't just about me. It's about all of us. It's about building a system that's fair, a system that doesn't treat people as disposable based on the color of their skin or the zip code they live in. We deserve better, and we're going to make it happen." The cheers that followed were deafening, and Tyrone felt a surge of hope unlike anything he'd ever known. He stepped down from the stage to thunderous applause, his heart full of gratitude and determination. In the months that followed, Tyrone's efforts began to bear fruit. New programs were implemented in the city to provide legal aid to underserved communities, and several policies aimed at reducing systemic bias were introduced. Tyrone himself was offered a scholarship to a prestigious university to study criminal justice, an opportunity he gladly accepted, determined to use his education to continue the fight. As he packed his bags for college, Deborah stood in the doorway, watching him with pride. "You've come a long way, Ty," she said softly. "I'm so proud of you." Tyrone smiled. I couldn't have done it without you, Mom. When he arrived on campus, Tyrone felt a mix of nerves and excitement. But as he looked around at the opportunities before him, he knew he was ready. His past hadn't defined him, it had prepared him. And his future was brighter than he had ever imagined. As he walked across the quad, he thought back to everything he had endured and everything he had overcome. He whispered to himself the words that had become his mantra. They tried to break me, but I'm still standing. And he knew without a doubt that he always would be.